The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Mount Olive Baptist Church as people dressed in black began gathering outside. Inside the church, a flag-draped casket held the body of Lisa Thompson, a beloved teacher who had fought cancer for 3 long years. Her husband David sat in the front pew, staring at his hands folded in his lap. The navy dress uniform he wore felt heavier than usual today. David had worn this same uniform in 12 different countries during his 15 years of service. He'd stood at attention in desert heat and freezing mountain bases, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The gold buttons on his jacket caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, each one polished to perfection, just like Lisa used to do before his deployments. "Daddy, why are all these people here?" 8-year-old Chloe whispered, tugging at his sleeve. Her small black dress was the same one Lisa had bought for last year's school concert. David's throat tightened as he looked down at his daughter's confused face. "They're here because Mommy touched a lot of lives, sweetheart," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these people loved her just like we do." The church was packed beyond capacity. Lisa's former students, now grown adults, had driven from neighboring states to pay their respects. Parents whose children she had taught filled every pew. The principal of Jefferson Elementary School spoke about how Lisa never missed a day, even during her chemotherapy treatments. She would wear colorful scarves to hide her hair loss, and somehow still managed to make every child in her classroom feel special. David's sister Angela sat beside him, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand. She had flown in from California, the moment she got his call 5 days ago. "The doctor said there's nothing more we can do," he had told her then, his voice breaking over the phone. Lisa had passed peacefully that evening, holding David's hand while Chloe slept curled up in the hospital chair beside them. The pastor, Reverend Williams, had known Lisa since she was Chloe's age. He spoke about her kindness, her laugh that could fill a room, and how she volunteered at the church food bank every Saturday morning for 10 years. David barely heard the words. His mind kept drifting to their last conversation. "Take care of our baby girl," Lisa had whispered, her hand weak but still warm in his. "And David, don't let this break you. Promise me you'll find happiness again someday." He had promised, though he couldn't imagine how. Lisa had been his anchor since high school. While he was deployed overseas, her daily emails and video calls with Chloe had kept him grounded. She sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and letters from her students thanking him for his service. During his darkest moments in Afghanistan, her picture tucked inside his helmet had reminded him what he was fighting to come home to. The service concluded with Lisa's favorite hymn, "Amazing Grace." David's voice cracked as he tried to sing along. Chloe held his hand tightly, her small fingers intertwined with his calloused ones. As the congregation began filing out, David felt overwhelmed by the crowd and the condolences. Everyone meant well, but their words felt hollow. Nothing, they said, could bring Lisa back or fill the enormous hole in his chest. "I need some air," he told Angela, loosening his tie slightly. The church felt stuffy despite the cool October weather outside. "Of course," she replied, keeping Chloe close as David made his way toward the exit. Outside, David stood on the church steps, breathing deeply. The funeral home director was coordinating the procession to Riverside Cemetery, where Lisa would be buried next to her parents. Family members and close friends gathered around the hearse, preparing for the final journey. David watched them through blurred vision, still unable to fully accept that this was really happening. His phone buzzed with a text message from his former teammate, Rodriguez. "On our way, brother. ETA 15 minutes. Lisa was family to all of us." David smiled slightly, remembering how Lisa had insisted on hosting barbecues for his Navy buddies whenever they were on leave. She treated them like the brothers they were to David, always making sure they had a home-cooked meal and someone to talk to. As David stood there lost in memories, a police cruiser pulled up across the street. Officer Walsh stepped out, adjusting his duty belt and putting on his sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He had been patrolling the area when dispatch mentioned a large gathering at the church. Nothing unusual, just keeping an eye on things as he always did during big events that drew crowds. Walsh was known around the precinct for being thorough, sometimes overly so. His fellow officers often joked that he could find something suspicious about a grandmother walking her dog. Today was no different. As he observed the scene, his eyes focused on David standing alone in his military uniform, slightly apart from the other mourners. Something about the situation bothered Walsh, though he couldn't put his finger on what exactly. Maybe it was David's posture, the way he kept checking his phone, or simply the fact that Walsh didn't recognize him from the neighborhood. In Walsh's mind, people in military uniforms standing around churches could mean anything these days. You had to be careful. David noticed the officer watching him but didn't think much of it. Police presence at large gatherings was normal. He was more focused on preparing himself for the cemetery service, the final goodbye that would make Lisa's death feel completely real. Angela appeared beside him with Chloe, who was clutching a small teddy bear that had belonged to Lisa. The cars are ready, David. It's time to go. As they walked toward the family car, Officer Walsh crossed the street, his hand resting on his radio. He had made up his mind. Something didn't feel right about this situation, and his job was to investigate anything that seemed out of place, even at a funeral. "Excuse me, sir," Walsh called out, his voice carrying the authority he had cultivated over 12 years on the force. "I need to speak with you for a moment." David turned around, confused. Other mourners were getting into their cars, and the hearse was preparing to leave. This was not the time for whatever this officer wanted to discuss. "Is there a problem, officer?" David asked politely, still holding Chloe's hand. He could see the concern in Angela's eyes as she watched the interaction unfold. What happened next would change everything, not just for David and his family, but for everyone who witnessed it. The grief-stricken widower had no idea that his simple question had just set in motion a chain of events that would make this day even more unforgettable than it already was. Officer Walsh approached David with the confident stride of someone used to being obeyed without question. His 12 years on the force had taught him that showing authority from the start usually prevented situations from escalating. What he didn't realize was that 3 men sitting in a black SUV across the street were watching his every move with the trained eyes of warriors. Chief Petty Officer Jake Rodriguez sat behind the wheel, his jaw tightening as he watched the officer approach his former teammate. Next to him, Petty Officer First Class Tommy Chen was already reaching for his phone. In the back seat, Petty Officer Second Class Mike Washington leaned forward, his hands instinctively clenching into fists. "This doesn't look right," Rodriguez muttered, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided his team through countless dangerous missions overseas. The 3 men had served with David in some of the most hostile territories in the world. They had saved each other's lives more times than they could count, and that bond didn't end when they returned to American soil. Rodriguez had driven 12 hours straight from Virginia Beach to be here. Chen had caught a red-eye flight from San Diego, and Washington had driven through the night from North Carolina. They weren't just attending a funeral, they were supporting a brother who had already sacrificed so much for his country, and was now facing the greatest loss of his personal life. Lisa had been like a sister to all of them. During their deployments, she had sent care packages not just to David, but to his entire unit. She remembered their birthdays, sent holiday cards, and always made sure they knew they had a family waiting for them back home. When Rodriguez got divorced, Lisa had spent hours on the phone with him, offering support and reminding him that his military brothers would always be there for him. "Something's wrong," Chen said, his finger already hovering over his phone's camera app. His training as a communications specialist had taught him the importance of documentation. If something bad was about to happen, they needed evidence. Washington, who had grown up in a neighborhood where police encounters could turn deadly in seconds, felt his stomach drop. "David's just trying to bury his wife, man. What could this cop possibly want with him right now?" The 3 SEALs watched as Walsh approached David, his hand resting on his radio in a way that suggested he was preparing for trouble. They couldn't hear the conversation from their distance, but David's body language told them everything they needed to know. Their brother was confused, trying to be respectful while dealing with an officer who seemed determined to create a problem. "I'm recording," Chen announced, holding up his phone. Years of combat experience had taught them that when things felt wrong, They usually were. Rodriguez, you still have that direct line to the base commander? Always, Rodriguez replied, already, pulling out his own phone. The three men had learned long ago that preparation and communication were the keys to survival, whether they were in Afghanistan or dealing with a situation back home. David's voice carried across the street as he tried to explain to Officer Walsh that he was attending his wife's funeral. The mourners who hadn't yet gotten into their cars were starting to notice the interaction. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was happening. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands where I can see them." Walsh's voice was loud enough for the SEALs to hear clearly now. The officer's tone had shifted from questioning to commanding, a change that sent alarm bells ringing in the minds of three combat veterans. "He's escalating," Washington said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "David's doing everything right, and this guy is still pushing." Angela, David's sister, was trying to shield 8-year-old Chloe from whatever was happening while also attempting to understand why a police officer was confronting her brother at their sister-in-law's funeral. Other family members were starting to gather, their confusion evident on their faces. Rodriguez was already dialing his commanding officer's direct line. In the military, when one of your own was in trouble, you didn't wait to see how bad it might get. You acted immediately and asked questions later. "Commander, this is Chief Rodriguez. We have a situation developing with one of our veterans. I need you to be aware of what's happening." Walsh's voice grew louder and more aggressive. "I said hands where I can see them. Now." David complied, raising his hands slightly while still trying to maintain his dignity in front of his daughter and the other mourners. "Officer, I'm not sure what the problem is. This is my wife's funeral and we need to get to the cemetery." "That's for me to determine," Walsh replied, his hand now moving toward his belt where his taser hung. "I've had reports of suspicious activity, and I need to check you for weapons." The word weapons sent a chill through the three SEALs watching from across the street. They knew David was unarmed. He had left his service weapon locked at home, as any responsible veteran would do when attending a civilian gathering. But they also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. Chen was now live-streaming the encounter on multiple social media platforms simultaneously, using skills he had developed during information warfare operations. His fingers moved quickly across his phone screen, tagging military advocacy groups, veteran support organizations, and local news outlets. Within minutes, the live stream was being shared across dozens of platforms. "Tommy, you getting all this?" Rodriguez asked, even as he continued his phone conversation with the base commander. "Every second," Chen replied, "and it's going out live to about 200 people already. That number's climbing fast." Washington was out of the SUV now, moving, with the silent precision that had made him one of the most effective reconnaissance specialists in his unit. He positioned himself where he could intervene quickly if necessary, while still maintaining a clear view of the situation. The funeral director approached Walsh, trying to explain that this was a private funeral and asking if whatever the officer needed could wait until after the burial. Walsh waved him off dismissively, his focus entirely on David, who stood there in his dress blues, looking more confused than concerned. "I'm going to need you to submit to a search," Walsh announced, loud, enough for everyone to hear. "Put your hands on the car and spread your legs." A collective gasp went up from the mourners. Chloe started crying, not understanding why a police officer was treating her daddy like a criminal. Angela pulled the little girl closer, her own eyes filling with tears of frustration and disbelief. "Officer, please," David said, his military training keeping his voice calm even as his heart raced. "I'm a decorated Navy veteran. I'm here to bury my wife. I have identification and I'm happy to show it to you, but I don't understand why you need to search me." The mention of David being a veteran seemed to make Walsh even more aggressive. "I don't care what you used to be," he snapped. "Right now, you're a potential threat, and I'm going to treat you like one." Rodriguez ended his call with the base commander and immediately dialed the Pentagon's Veteran Affairs liaison. Chen's live stream had reached over 1,000 viewers and was being shared by military families across the country. Washington had quietly alerted the local FBI field office, using contacts he had developed during his intelligence work. The three SEALs were coordinating their response with the same precision they had used in combat zones. They weren't just three friends watching their buddy get harassed by a cop. They were a tactical unit responding to a threat against one of their own, and they were treating it with the same seriousness they would have shown to any enemy action overseas. "David's about to become a hashtag," Chen muttered, watching the viewer count on his live stream continue to climb. "This is going to blow up in about 30 seconds. None of them could have predicted just how right he was about to be. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. Officer Walsh had David turn around and place his hands on the funeral car, right in front of his 8-year-old daughter and dozens of mourners. The image was heartbreaking. A grieving father in his military dress uniform being treated like a criminal at his wife's funeral. "This is wrong on so many levels," David said quietly, his voice carrying just enough for the people nearby to hear. Even in this humiliating moment, his military training kept him calm and respectful. But inside, his heart was breaking all over again. This was supposed to be about honoring Lisa, not about whatever power trip this officer was on. Angela was trying to comfort Chloe, who was sobbing and asking why the policeman was being mean to her daddy. "It's okay, sweetheart," Angela whispered, though she didn't believe her own words. Nothing about this situation was okay. Walsh began patting David down roughly, making a show of the search. "You military types think you're above the law," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "But out here, I'm the one in charge." That comment was the final straw for Rodriguez. He had seen enough combat and enough real criminals to know the difference between a threat and a grieving widower. More importantly, he had heard enough disrespect toward veterans to last several lifetimes. "Mike, Tommy, it's time," Rodriguez said into his phone. The three SEALs had been communicating through their earpieces, coordinating their approach like they were moving on an enemy position, except this enemy wore a badge and was supposed to protect people like David. Washington was already crossing the street, his movement fluid and purposeful. Chen continued live streaming while also coordinating with military contacts who were now fully aware of the situation. The viewer count had exploded to over 5,000 people watching in real time, and the shares were climbing by the minute. Rodriguez stepped out of the SUV and began walking toward the scene with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous places on earth. His dress uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect, and his expression was that of a man who had seen too much injustice to let it slide anymore. As the three SEALs approached, other mourners began pulling out their phones. The funeral director looked panicked, unsure how to handle a situation that was spiraling far beyond anything he had ever dealt with. Reverend Williams emerged from the church, drawn by the commotion and the sound of Chloe crying. Walsh was still searching David when he noticed the three men approaching. Something about their coordinated movement and military bearing made him nervous, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. He had started this confrontation, and he was going to finish it on his terms. "This is none of your business," Walsh called out to the approaching SEALs. "Keep moving." Rodriguez stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to avoid being accused of interfering physically. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had given life and death orders in combat zones. "Officer, I'm Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, United States Navy SEALs. The man you're searching is a decorated veteran who served 3 tours overseas. He is currently attending his wife's funeral, and I need to ask what probable cause you have for this search." The crowd fell silent. Even Chloe stopped crying for a moment, sensing that something important was happening. Rodriguez's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. This wasn't a citizen complaining about police behavior. This was one professional addressing another, and the difference was obvious to everyone present. Walsh's face reddened. "I don't need to explain myself to you. This man was acting suspiciously, and I'm conducting a lawful search." "Suspiciously how?" Washington asked, positioning himself where he could see both Walsh and David clearly. His tone was respectful but firm. "Standing outside a church in dress uniform at his wife's funeral? I'd like to understand the suspicious behavior you observed." Chen continued recording everything, while simultaneously uploading clips to social media platforms. His military communications training had taught him how to quickly disseminate information through multiple channels, and he was putting those skills to work. The hashtag #veteran funeral was already trending in several states. This incident is being documented and broadcast live to thousands of viewers, Chen announced calmly. It's also being reviewed by military officials and veteran advocacy groups across the country. Walsh realized he was now facing 3 active duty SEALs, a growing crowd of angry mourners, and thousands of online viewers. But backing down would mean admitting he was wrong, and his ego wouldn't allow that. Instead, he doubled down. "I don't care who's watching," Walsh said, his voice getting louder. "I'm conducting a lawful investigation, and anyone who interferes will be arrested." Rodriguez pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Base Command, this is Chief Rodriguez. We have a situation requiring immediate intervention. A veteran is being unlawfully detained at his wife's funeral, and local law enforcement is escalating despite no apparent cause." The conversation was loud enough for Walsh to hear, and it clearly rattled him. He hadn't expected military officials to become involved so quickly. In his mind, this was supposed to be a simple stop and search that would be over in minutes. Reverend Williams approached the group, his presence adding another layer of authority to the situation. "Officer Walsh, I've known David Thompson for over 10 years. He's a member of this congregation, a decorated veteran, and he just lost his wife to cancer. This is neither the time nor the place for whatever you think you're accomplishing." Angela had managed to get Chloe into one of the cars, but the little girl was still watching through the window, trying to understand why her daddy was in trouble. The image of her pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her face, was captured by multiple cameras and would later become one of the most powerful photos associated with the incident. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Walsh told Angela, who had returned to support her brother. "This is police business." "This is my brother at my sister-in-law's funeral," Angela replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "What police business could you possibly have here?" The funeral director approached Walsh nervously. "Officer, we have a burial scheduled at the cemetery. The family needs to leave soon or we'll lose our time slot. Could this wait until after the service?" Walsh ignored him completely, his focus entirely on maintaining control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. The presence of the 3 SEALs had changed everything. What should have been a simple encounter with a lone veteran had become a confrontation with trained military personnel who knew their rights and weren't intimidated by his badge. Rodriguez ended his call and approached Walsh again. "Officer, I've just spoken with the base commander who is in contact with your chief of police. Military legal counsel is being dispatched, and federal authorities have been notified of this incident. I strongly suggest you reconsider your actions." The mention of federal authorities made Walsh's stomach drop. He had expected this to be a routine encounter that would be forgotten by everyone except the veteran he was hassling. Instead, he was now dealing with military officials, federal oversight, and a live stream that had reached tens of thousands of viewers. Washington positioned himself where he could clearly see David, who was still standing with his hands on the car, maintaining his dignity despite the humiliation. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," David replied, though his voice was strained. "I just want to bury my wife." Those words hit everyone present like a physical blow. Here was a man who had served his country faithfully, who had just lost the love of his life, and who was being treated like a criminal for no apparent reason. The injustice of it was overwhelming. Chen's livestream chat was exploding with comments from viewers, many of them veterans who were sharing their own experiences with police harassment. Military families across the country were tagging their local representatives and news outlets. The incident was becoming much bigger than anyone at the scene had anticipated. Walsh reached for his radio, calling for backup, but what he didn't realize was that Rodriguez had already contacted the FBI field office. Chen had alerted military police, and Washington had reached out to veteran advocacy lawyers. The cavalry was coming, but it wasn't coming for the veteran. Officer Walsh was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, but he didn't know it yet. As he reached for his taser, determined to show everyone who was in charge, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. But these weren't the backup units he had called for. These were federal vehicles responding to a completely different set of phone calls. The first to arrive was an unmarked black SUV with government plates. Two FBI agents stepped out, their suits and serious expressions immediately changing the atmosphere at the scene. Agent Patricia Collins, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau, surveyed the situation with experienced eyes. Her partner, Agent Robert Kim, was already on his phone coordinating with other agencies. "What do we have here?" Agent Collins asked, her voice carrying the authority that comes with federal jurisdiction. She looked at David, still standing with his hands on the funeral car, then at Officer Walsh, whose hand was hovering near his taser. Before Walsh could answer, Rodriguez stepped forward. "Agent Collins, I'm Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. This is a decorated Navy veteran being unlawfully detained at his wife's funeral. The entire incident has been documented and is currently being live-streamed to over 50,000 viewers." Agent Collins raised an eyebrow at the mention of 50,000 viewers. In today's world, viral incidents involving law enforcement could become national news within hours. The FBI had protocols for situations that might escalate into civil rights violations, especially when they involved military personnel. "Officer Walsh," she said, reading his name tag, "I need you to step away from Mr. Thompson immediately." Walsh's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. "Agent, this is my jurisdiction. I'm conducting a lawful investigation based on suspicious behavior reports." "What reports?" Agent Kim asked, pulling out a notepad. His tone was professional but skeptical. "We've reviewed the dispatch logs. There were no calls about suspicious activity at this location." The crowd of mourners was growing larger as word spread about what was happening. People who had already left for the cemetery were turning around and coming back. Local residents were walking over from nearby houses. Chen's livestream had been shared so many times that news vans were already on their way. A second government vehicle arrived, this one carrying military police officers from the nearby naval base. Sergeant First Class Williams stepped out in full dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of multiple overseas deployments. He walked directly to David, who was still maintaining his position against the funeral car. "Sir, you can put your hands down," Sergeant Williams said gently. "We're here now." David slowly lowered his hands, his military training having kept him calm throughout the entire ordeal. But now that help had arrived, the emotional weight of everything hit him at once. He was burying his wife. His daughter was traumatized, and he had been humiliated in front of his entire community. Angela rushed over to her brother, wrapping him in a protective hug. "Are you okay?" she whispered, though they both knew the answer was no. Nothing about this day had been okay from the moment Officer Walsh decided to target a grieving widower. Chloe jumped out of the funeral car and ran to her father, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "Daddy, I was scared," she sobbed into his uniform jacket. David knelt down and held his daughter close, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. The arrival of the mayor's car surprised everyone, including the federal agents. Mayor Jennifer Rodriguez had received multiple phone calls in the past 30 minutes, including one from a Pentagon liaison and another from the governor's office. The incident was becoming a political nightmare, and she needed to control the damage quickly. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, though she already knew from the briefing she had received during her frantic drive to the church. Her chief of staff was in the passenger seat, frantically taking notes and coordinating with the mayor's communications team. Officer Walsh was now completely surrounded by federal agents, military police, his own supervisors who had finally arrived, and the mayor of the city. The simple traffic stop he had imagined had turned into a jurisdictional nightmare involving multiple agencies and levels of government. "Ma'am, I was responding to reports of suspicious activity." Walsh repeated his story, though it sounded weaker each time he said it. Agent Kim had already confirmed there were no such reports in the system. "Officer Walsh," the mayor said, her voice icy with controlled anger, "you just tased a decorated veteran at his wife's funeral in front of his 8-year-old daughter, and you did it while 50,000 people watched online. Do you have any Idea what you've done? The crowd fell silent at the mention of tasering. Many people hadn't seen that part of the incident, having arrived after it happened. The revelation sent a wave of shock and anger through the assembled mourners and neighbors. Agent Collins was reviewing the live stream footage on Chen's phone, her expression growing more serious with each passing minute. Officer Walsh, based on what I'm seeing here, you may be facing federal civil rights charges. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right. Police Chief Brandon Murphy arrived just in time to hear his officer being read his rights by a federal agent. Chief Murphy had been with the department for 25 years and had never seen anything like this. His phone had been ringing nonstop with calls from reporters, city council members, and federal officials. Officer Walsh, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation, Chief Murphy announced. Turn in your badge and weapon, now. Walsh's world was crumbling around him. What had started as a routine day on patrol had turned into the end of his career and possibly his freedom. He slowly removed his badge and handed over his service weapon to his chief, his hands shaking with the realization of what he had done. The funeral director approached the group cautiously. I hate to interrupt, but we're already an hour behind schedule for the burial. The family has been through enough today. David looked up from comforting his daughter. Can we please just lay my wife to rest? That's all I wanted to do today, Agent Yer. Collins nodded respectfully. Mr. Thompson, we'll need to speak with you later for our investigation, but there's no reason you can't proceed with the burial. We have everything we need from the witnesses and the video evidence. Rodriguez, Washington, and Chen formed a protective circle around David and his family as they prepared to leave for the cemetery. The three SEALs had accomplished their mission. They had protected their brother and ensured that justice would be served. As the funeral procession finally began to move toward the cemetery, news vans were arriving from 3 different television stations. The story was already being picked up by national news networks, and social media was exploding with reactions from veterans, military families, and civil rights advocates across the country. Mayor Rodriguez was already on the phone, with her legal team, preparing for the lawsuits that were sure to follow. The city's insurance company would need to be notified, and there would likely be federal oversight of the police department's practices and training. Officer Walsh sat in the back of his former colleague's patrol car, no longer a police officer, but now a suspect in a federal investigation. His lawyer would later tell him that the video evidence was so damning that a plea bargain might be his only option. As David's family drove toward the cemetery, followed by dozens of supporters and the watchful eyes of federal agents, the live stream continued. Chen had decided to document the entire burial service, ensuring that Lisa Thompson's final farewell would be remembered not just for the injustice that preceded it, but for the love and community support that followed. The incident had lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would be felt for years to come. 3 Navy SEALs had kept their promise to always protect their brothers in arms, and their swift action had prevented a tragedy from becoming something even worse. 3 months later, David Thompson stood in a federal courtroom watching Officer Walsh receive his sentence. The former police officer had been convicted on multiple federal charges, including civil rights violations and assault on a military veteran. The judge's words still echoed in David's mind. Your actions on that day disgraced not only your badge, but the very principles this nation was founded upon. Walsh received 3 years in federal prison, lost his pension, and would never be allowed to work in law enforcement again. But for David, no amount of justice could bring back the dignity that had been stolen from Lisa's funeral. Some wounds heal with time, others leave permanent scars. The 3 Navy SEALs who had intervened that day became heroes in the veteran community. Rodriguez, Washington, and Chen received commendations from their commanding officers and were invited to speak at military academies about leadership under pressure. Their quick thinking and professional response had been studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of how to properly document and respond to police misconduct. We just did what any brother would do, Rodriguez had told reporters after the trial. David served his country with honor for 15 years. The least we could do was serve him when he needed us most. The incident had sparked nationwide conversations about police accountability and the treatment of veterans. David's story became a rallying point for reform advocates, though he never sought the spotlight. He just wanted to raise his daughter and honor his wife's memory in peace. Chloe, now 9 years old, still had nightmares sometimes about that day. She would wake up crying, asking David why the police officer had been so mean to him. David would hold her close and explain that most police officers were good people who wanted to help, but sometimes bad people got jobs they shouldn't have. It was a difficult conversation for a father to have with his daughter, but necessary. In a world where such injustices existed, the therapist David had started seeing helped him work through his anger and trauma. "It's normal to feel rage about what happened," Dr. Martinez had told him during one of their sessions. "But don't let that anger consume the love you have for Lisa's memory or your daughter's future." The civil lawsuit David filed against the city resulted in a 7-figure settlement, most of which he put into a trust fund for Chloe's education. He donated a portion to veteran advocacy groups and used some to establish a scholarship at Lisa's old school in her memory. Money couldn't fix what had been broken, but it could help prevent others from experiencing similar injustices. The police department where Walsh had worked underwent a complete overhaul. The FBI investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct and inadequate training that had been ignored by previous administrations. Chief Murphy was forced to retire early, and the new chief implemented body cameras, civilian oversight, and mandatory training on veteran affairs and mental health awareness. Mayor Rodriguez used the incident as a catalyst for comprehensive police reform throughout the city. She established a citizen review board with real authority to investigate complaints and hired a team of social workers to respond to mental health calls alongside police officers. The changes weren't perfect, but they were a start. Chen's livestream had been viewed over 2 million times across all platforms, making it one of the most watched police accountability videos in recent history. The footage was used in training, programs for law enforcement agencies, showing officers exactly what not to do when interacting with the public. Chen continued his Navy career, but also became an advocate for transparency and accountability in all forms of public service. Washington left active duty the following year and founded a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to veterans facing discrimination or harassment. His first-hand experience with the incident gave him credibility with both veterans and law enforcement officials who wanted to do better. His organization helped dozens of veterans each year navigate complex legal situations. The church where Lisa's funeral had been held installed a memorial garden in her honor. Reverend Williams worked with David to create a peaceful space where families could remember their loved ones without fear of harassment or disruption. The garden included a plaque that read, "In memory of Lisa Thompson, beloved teacher and wife, whose final farewell reminded us all that dignity and justice must never be taken for granted." David eventually returned to work as a defense contractor, using his military experience to help train the next generation of Navy personnel. His colleagues knew his story, but they treated him with the respect he had always deserved. The incident had made him somewhat famous in veteran circles, though he preferred to keep a low profile and focus on his work and his daughter. The legal precedent set by David's case helped other veterans who faced similar situations. Civil rights lawyers now had a clear example of how modern technology and military networks could be used to document and respond to police misconduct. Several other cases were successfully prosecuted using similar strategies and evidence-gathering techniques. On the first anniversary of Lisa's death, David and Chloe visited her grave without incident. They brought flowers and spent time talking to her headstone about everything that had happened since she passed away. Chloe told her mother about school, her friends, and how proud she was of her daddy for being so brave. "Mommy, the nice police officers came to my school to talk about safety," Chloe said, kneeling by the headstone. "They were nothing like that mean man. Daddy says most police officers are good people who want to help." David had worked hard to make sure his daughter didn't grow up hating or fearing all police officers because of one bad experience. He arranged for positive interactions with community police officers and made sure she understood that Walsh's behavior was not normal or acceptable. The three SEALs remained close friends with David and his family. They visited regularly and included Chloe and their own family gatherings. She called them Uncle Rodriguez, Uncle Washington, and Uncle Chen, and they spoiled her with the affection of honorary uncles who had helped save her father when he needed them most. Rodriguez often reflected on how different that day could have gone if they hadn't been there. David's military training kept him calm and respectful, even when he was being humiliated, he told his wife one evening. But not every veteran would have handled it the same way. This could have ended much worse. The incident had also strengthened the bond between the four men. They had served together overseas, but protecting David at Lisa's funeral had been just as important as any mission they had completed in uniform. It reminded them that their duty to each other didn't end when they took off their uniforms. David often spoke at veteran events about the importance of community and standing up for each other. His message was simple. We serve together overseas and we need to serve each other at home. When one of us is in trouble, we all need to be ready to step up. 2 years after the incident, David met Jennifer, a nurse who worked at the VA hospital. She understood the challenges veterans faced and didn't judge him for the difficult moments he still had because of his experiences. Chloe liked her immediately, and slowly, carefully, David began to open his heart to the possibility of love. Again, Lisa would have approved, he thought. She had made him promise not to let tragedy break him, and with the help of his military brothers and his daughter's resilience, he was keeping that promise one day at a time. The story of that terrible day at Lisa's funeral became a symbol of how ordinary people could fight injustice when they stood together. But for David, it was simply the day his brothers proved that some bonds are unbreakable, no matter how much time passes or how far apart life takes you.